Open your Bibles, if you would, to Jeremiah, and we're going to be in chapter 2. Jeremiah chapter 2. And we have given out booklets for the entire series. If you do not have a booklet, or if you do not have the lesson sheet for this morning, I'll be glad to send someone after some if you'll raise your hand. Randy, if you'd run out, there's. You haven't got a booklet yet at all, Monzel? You've been sick, haven't you? On the table, grab her a whole booklet, Randy. Anyone else need today or the whole thing? Maybe they are going. He went back to grab some and they were going again. All right, I'll have to make another set, but he can get you today's and bring it up to you. Jeremiah chapter 2. And we're talking about Jeremiah, and what's he known as? A weeping prophet, right? He's the weeping prophet, and so much so that he has also written what book? Lamentations, the Lamentations of Jeremiah the prophet. And so here's this prophet, and he's prophesying during what time period? Right now, and what's going on with God's people? Okay, they're in captivity, right? And we kind of, the captivity kind of happens over a period of time. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago when we tried to just give a high-speed history refresher on Wednesday night. But here's this prophet who's trying to implore God's people basically to just stay the course, accept God's judgment in the moment, and we'll be all right on the other side. But what happens is they resist and fight and challenge, and Jeremiah keeps begging them to do the right things. And so there's lots of difficulty that Jeremiah tries to overcome. And how attentive are they with his message? Not very, right? They're not very attentive at all. At the beginning of chapter 2, what is Jeremiah doing? If you look, let me just pull the lesson sheets up because that might actually help us walk through these first 10 or 11 verses or so of this chapter. But in the first part of the chapter, what does he remember about God's people? Okay. All right. And was that, as he reveals to them this historical perspective on their relationship with God, he reminds them of a time when it was what? Good, right? He reminds them of a time when their relationship with God was good. It was a lot better than it was in the present. And so the implication of that is that's where we used to be. We need to suffer through the judgment of consequence of God in the moment and strive to do what? Get back there, right? We need to get back to that point where our relationship with God is what it should be. He asked the question, God did only good to them in verses 4 through 8. What was the Lord's question in verse 5? Okay, yeah. Right. And let's just kind of throw that word at the, what did God do? God says, what wrong had I offered to you? What challenge did I present to you? What reason did you have to depart? Is that a fair question today, by the way? Sure, that's a fair question. God, I think, has every right to look down upon me and say, what did I do to create such animosity that you have towards me? Why is it that you have chosen to walk a different path and reject the things that I'm offering to you? Had God been blessing them? Yeah, and if you go back in their history, so long as they were faithful to Him, were good things happening? Yeah, when did conflict come? When they weren't, right? So Jeremiah is just trying to remind them of that. That we're in this circumstance because of whom? Because of ourselves. We caused this. Okay, God gave us a good land in which to live. God blessed us with the land that flowed with milk and honey, and we're the reason why we're having this difficulty now. We're the ones at fault. And so that's the memory that Jeremiah is trying to put into their minds at the outset of this particular chapter. Any thoughts up to about verse 12? Right. You're accountable for this. And that's basically what Jeremiah is saying to the people. You're accountable for this. And because the tendency is when a judgment comes or condemnation comes or discipline comes, what's the tendency to do? Blame somebody else. Why are you doing this to me? How come? And without ever thinking about the fact that I caused this circumstances. My choices, my decision making, my poor decision making at times is what caused this circumstance to begin with. Yeah. Right. Right. And it is a shame but that tends to be the reality sometimes. Is that when somebody's choices, decisions have forced the hand, for lack of a better description of that it has forced elders and congregations to have to address the sin or the problem that exists. And in the moment you do, then all of a sudden all the anger comes out against those who are just simply doing what God has encouraged us to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and you had a very peculiar relationship with God, and you've wrecked it. And it's a shame that they had chosen um, those paths. I want you to notice with me verse 13. He said, "For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn them out cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water." And so he says, number one, they've abandoned whom? The God that can give what? Living water. Okay, fountains of living waters. I'm refreshing you in what manner? Spirit, but continually, right? This is living waters. These waters are continual. My blessings and benefits to you were continual, over and over and over again. And your evils have been the fact that you forsook me, the fountain of living waters, and you've what? Yeah, you dug out cisterns, broken cisterns that can't what? Hold any water. I was supplying you with living water continually. In other words, you didn't have to what? You didn't even need you didn't even need a cistern. You didn't even need a place to store it because it's just continual. Well, and there may be some comparison there. To me, the general feel simply was that you had a continual supply of living water, which you said, I don't want that anymore. I don't want that supply anymore. And instead, you chose allegiances and decisions and things where now you're depending on who? Themselves. Now you're depending on yourself. When you were dependent on God, the waters just flowed. When you started trusting in yourselves, you started having to dig cisterns and create circumstances to try to sustain yourself. And he said they weren't even beneficial. They were broken, had holes, wouldn't contain anything. You traded living waters for nothing. And isn't it amazing how you see people who'll trade away everything of value for nothing. And they had the greatest relationship they could ever experience with God, and they traded it all away for nothing. And it's really sad when you think about their circumstance. He said, "Is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Why has he become a prey?" Why is it that all these nations now all of a sudden that are round about them have the ability to make them captive and destroy them and create destruction? When you gave up the living waters, that also means you gave up the protection of God. You've given up on His umbrella of strength that He had been providing you. I mean, you think about a history of a people. And I can't help but wonder, tonight, Lord willing, in the sermon, we're going to go back and look at Rahab for a little while and examine some things out of that account and history in relation to Rahab. But they were winning battles by walking around cities and watching the walls fall down. You know, they were winning battles and wars in some of the most unconventional ways that you could ever imagine because of the power of God that was behind them. But the minute they began to trust in themselves, now they became vulnerable. People that never could have offered any kind of calamity or challenge to them, now all of a sudden is a threat. We sometimes become perplexed and challenged by things that never before bothered us, or hindered us, or affected us, or influenced us. All because we have detached ourselves from God. And because of that, we create ourselves in a more vulnerable state. The more distant we are from God, the more vulnerable we are. That's the point that I think we can learn from in this text. Is the more we separate ourselves from God, the more vulnerable we become to everything that challenges us in life. And so we need to heed the warning. Theirs was very real. Ours is real in a different way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. For a bowl of stew. Yeah. And the ramifications of all of that. And sometimes in the moment, we have an inability to value things in the right way. And Esau's perception was, I'm about to what? I'm about to die. And yet, I've said before, you've heard me talk about the fact that must have been the most miraculous bowl of stew I've ever seen. Because it took a man from nigh unto death, apparently, to able to walk away and feeling great. And so I've always wondered about that. Did he have a real good perspective on what his real circumstance really was? But you're absolutely right, Pam. He didn't just give away a basic family inheritance. He gave away right to be in the line that would ultimately bring Jesus, which they were supposed to be longing for and wanting to be part of. And so it's amazing how folks give up much more valuable things for the temporary. Yeah. And there's his daughter, right. So there's, folks need to think through what they're about to give up, especially when they distance themselves from God. The young lions, he said, have roared upon him and yelled, and they have made his land waste. His cities are burned up without inhabitant. The children also of Memphis and Tahpanhes have broken the crown of thy head. Hast thou not procured this unto thyself, in that thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God, and when he led thee by the way? Young nations, new nations, up and rising empires, right? Remember, it was the Syrians, then the Assyrians, right? And each one growing stronger and stronger. These upstart empires, these young lions. And there was a point in time, if I'm understanding it right, where God had been protecting you while you were serving Him. But now these new empires, these new strengths and power that are around you, all of a sudden they're having an effect, an ability to challenge you. And he says, you caused it. Verse 17. Because again of their rejection of God. Verse 18, now what hast thou to do in the way to Egypt, to drink the waters of Shihor? Or what hast thou to do in the way to Assyria, to drink the waters of the river? Thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backsliding shall reprove thee. Know therefore and see that it is an evil thing and a bitter that thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord Jehovah of hosts. And so that's, to me, that's an interesting concept, because he said, your own behaviors will be what? Right. It'll be the measuring stick. Notice, thine own wickedness, verse 19. Thine own wickedness shall correct thee. Back to something Jack mentioned earlier, sometimes uh, the consequences of my own action come to fruition. The choices that I make and the destruction that I'm bringing to myself happen, and they're sometimes the greatest correcting tool that there ever is. How many times have you been doing something? You ever try to put in a light switch or a light socket and thinking, I can do this without turning the power off? How many times do you generally try that? Well, hopefully only once, right? Hopefully once you get the twinge of voltage going through your body, you hopefully you learn, right? Your own mistakes are sometimes the most corrective moments. And so that's kind of what he's saying here. He said, again, he's not excusing their behavior. He's not saying it was okay for them to abandon God. But what he's saying is, I hope you learned something from it. I hope that your choices and your decisions and what it has done to you. You were a great nation. Now you're what? You're rubble. You're nothing. Okay? You're nothing. You don't even get to lead yourselves. You've got puppet kings that other nations are establishing over in terms of rule to you. Your cities are not nearly what they used to be. All because you forsook God. You're reaping the consequences of your own decisions. For the old time I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bonds, and thou saidst, I will not serve. For upon every high hill and under every green tree thou didst bow thyself, playing the harlot. It's interesting. That kind of language is used on many occasions in relationship to God and His people. And because they're under what kind of relationship? Okay, and it's a bond. Notice the words. And burst thy bonds. There's a vow. There's a covenant. That's maybe a better word. There's a covenant between God's people and God. And when they forsake the covenant, he uses language that's pretty strong. He says, you're playing the harlot. You've introduced allegiances and things into this relationship that don't have any business being there. We would speak about that in marriage relationships, right? We'd say somebody who breaks the bond of marriage has introduced things into that marriage that ought not be. They've played the harlot. They've adulterated the covenant that should have been honored and respected. What he's saying to them is, you have adulterated the covenant between ourselves. And because of that, I've set you loose. And you've chosen not to serve. And you've chosen to make your allegiances elsewhere, even though I was the real strength, encouraging you through all of those things. Verse 22, for though thou wash thee with lye, and take thee much soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord. How canst thou say, I am not defiled, I have not gone after the Balaam? See thy way in the valley, know what thou hast done. Thou art a swift dromedary, traversing her ways, a wild donkey used to the wilderness, that snuffeth up the wind in her desire, in her occasion who can turn her away. All they that seek her will not weary themselves. In her month they shall find her. And so he draws this interesting picture. He says, verse 22, for though thou wash thee with lye and use a lot of soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord Jehovah. Sometimes people, rather than trying to change their sinful behaviors, what do they try to do? Try to cover it up, right? Try to make it so they throw perfume at it, okay, for lack of a better description. They use soap. In a sense, they try to dress it in such a way that it doesn't appear to be the same vile thing that it is. That seems to me the picture that he's drawing here. He says, you made attempts to try to cover up your behaviors, but unsuccessfully. God has marked it. God has identified what the sins are. You can dress up your sins all day long. God sees right through it. And you and I can attempt to make sin sound better and look better and not seem as bad as it really is. And we can dress it up all day long. But God still is able to mark it and identify it. And that's something that needs to be understood. Sometimes we may not be able to discern and identify things as quickly and easily as we should, but God always can. And God's able to identify and understand the reality of certain circumstances much quicker than we are. So we can't hide it from Him. We may be able to hide it from men. We may be able to dress it up, and men may not look at it as being sinful, and men may not see it in the reality that it is, but God can see it very quickly. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah, those kinds of things could fall under that same umbrella. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't confess. Okay. Not sure whether we got a problem or not. Maybe a false alarm. I'm not sure. Okay. It's all good. Like a teacher, eyes back front. Ron's got it under control for me back there. Okay, so here's this circumstance where as Bob's talking about, how sometimes we will state our sinful behaviors. Sometimes we'll acknowledge them in the sense of it having to admit, because sometimes we get what? Sometimes we get caught, right? And sometimes when you're caught, you don't have any choice but to what? Yeah, fess up. I mean, what are you going to do at that point, right? You're caught, and there's no getting around it. You don't have anything else you can do but just acknowledge what happened. And so sometimes we only admit the obvious, and we don't necessarily make changes, or we don't necessarily change it. Particularly, we don't change the way we think about sin. I've often thought that's one of the greatest problems we have is that we don't. Sometimes we want to change the behaviors without changing the way we think about sin first. Romans chapter 12 says, "Be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind." You've got to change the way you think about the world before you can change the way we conduct ourselves in relationship to it. So a lot of folks, maybe that's kind of the imagery here, is, okay, we willing to say we did all these things, but no real change taking place. And so the condemnation's still coming, and the judgment's coming. And keep in mind, remember the history that we talked about prior to this, is that they had reached a point where God said what? We're beyond being able to change this. The sins of who, if you remember? Over Judah. Manasseh, right? The sins of Manasseh were so tremendous, and he had guided the people in such horrible ways that God said, though one came after him that was a decent king, the judgment had been sealed. It's coming. And so you can dress it up, make it look different, try to do whatever you can, but he said it's done. And they had become some pretty interesting descriptions there, according to Jeremiah. Yeah, they have. They've lost all ability to really think straight, especially from a spiritual mindset that they should have had. And undoubtedly, that's due partly or strongly due to the leadership they had. Their kings had created some pretty vile things, and because of that, that was causing greater challenges. Withhold thy foot, he says, from being unshod, and thy throat from thirst. But thou saidst, it is in vain. No, for I have loved strangers, and after them will I go. I'm giving you living waters, but you want what? Strange waters. Contentment's hard, isn't it? We have phrases, don't we? We say the grass is always greener on the other side, right? We always have this imagery that something that somebody else has is better than what I have. And that's what the nation had done. They looked at the nations round about them and had decided that what those nations had was better than what God was giving them. And they had made decisions and choices that the grass was greener, and so I loved the stranger's way of doing things more than mine. And in particular, that's in relationship to what? Their worship and the idolatry, okay? They looked at those other nations and they had all these idols and gods that they were getting to worship, and they get to worship the sun one day and the moon the next day and the dirt the next day and the trees the next day and the butterfly the next day, because there were gods everywhere, right? And that seemed interesting to them. We have to get up every day and honor what? One measly God. That's all. And that's their mindset. That's their mindset. They just were completely dissatisfied with what God was offering. So God said, fine, go over and worship those idols, because those idols were what? False, non-existent, unreal. What could they really offer? Nothing. Go ahead. Go worship those idols. See what kind of water they're able to provide. See what kind of good comes from that. And the consequences that ultimately arrived. Any thoughts up to that point? It's going to be a fun week. If I can't get past it. That didn't help a bit. Yeah. Yeah. Don't learn anything. Yeah. It's always hard to know exactly, and we won't know what's in the mind of God in relationship. But any nation that has been blessed because of their general connection to God ought to be very careful about distancing themselves from Him. Yeah, yeah. As the thief is ashamed, he says, when he is found, so is the house of Israel ashamed. They, their kings, their princes, and their priests, and their prophets, who say to a stock, Thou art my father, and to a stone, Thou hast brought me forth. For they have turned their back unto me, and not their face. But in the time of their trouble, they will say, Arise and save us. Is that fair? They looked at this rock over here and said, Help me. I honor you. You're my new God. And they looked over here and saw something else. Said, You're my new God. You help me out. And when all of that failed and they hit rock bottom, then what did they want to do? Now I want to go to God and say, Save me. I simply submit to you, I don't know that that's fair. I don't know that that's a fair process, especially with that mindset. Because they're basically not, it wasn't a realization that I have dishonored God, I need to repent from that and renew my relationship with Him. That's a different thing. What they have done is they turned to anything and everything to help them, and when all of that failed, then they did what? Now I turn to God. God became their port of last resort. He was just a last resort to them. This wasn't about repentance and a recognition that they had failed Him and wanted to come back. This was, well, I guess the rock, the tree, the turkey buzzard, whatever else they were worshiping, didn't help me. Now I'm going to look to Jehovah. And it's, God says, I'm sorry. It's just not going to work. We do the same things. And when I say we, I mean generically, people do the same thing today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and you would hope that that's even part of it, Tom. But in my mind, I even wonder whether the light bulb's even going. I wonder whether they've just reached a point where, well, we've tried everything else. I guess we'll look to Jehovah again. And God says, not this time. There have been times where they gotten off course, and He got them back on course, and they'd gotten off course, but He says, not this time. At least not for a while yet. But where are thy gods, verse 28, that thou hast made thee? Let them arise, and they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods, O Judah. Wherefore will ye count... Let me stop for a second. According to the number of thy cities are thy gods. In other words, it appears that what? Every town had her own God. Okay, you've gotten away from Jehovah, the one true God, and you've done that in such ways that now you're saying, well, you know, every town's got its own God. You know, every town's got its own centerpiece. And so we come to the town square, we come to the center of town, and we've got our own God. We don't want that God in New Martinsville, right? We want our own God here in Payton City. We want our own God down there in Sistersville. And so we isolated ourselves in such a way that we want to identify with our own, when there was only supposed to be one God over all of them. But that's how, to me, that's just an illustration by Jeremiah of how bad it had gotten. Is it hard sometimes for people to realize how bad it's really gotten? It's hard sometimes. I think that sometimes, because things happen, generally things happen gradually, over time, subtly, right? And you look back over a span of time and you begin to see the results of it. If sometimes, maybe we sound like an alarmist. Sometimes maybe it sounds like we are challenging things for the sake of challenging them. But maybe the truth is that we have seen the progression, and we have watched how something that seems so small and insignificant in the moment, once it began over a 25, 35, 40-year period, became something completely different. Because it subtly changed, fundamentally changed the Lord's church. Right. And so those subtle changes over a period of time may seem, again, insignificant, and you may sound old-fashioned trying to resist it, but maybe the reality is it's because we've seen the results of what subtlety and the slow progression away from God can do. Jeremiah, I believe, in some ways is simply saying to them, you don't even know how bad it's got. You've got gods in every town. That's how bad it's got. You thought it was just, well, think about that. When did that whole mindset of let's get our own gods or establish places of idol worship, when did it happen? Right, when they divided, right? They had one God up to that point. Divided kingdom comes. Israel doesn't want folks going down to Jerusalem and being influenced by Judah. So we'll set up our own places in Dan and Bethel, and we'll set up our own couple of places of worship. We only had then what? 2. Just 2. And now you've got them where? Every town, and not just in Israel, but former Israel, but even down in Judah. You've got them everywhere. What started out so simple, seems so innocent, seems so reasonable, right? Why wouldn't it be reasonable to say, well, the people in the northern part of our kingdom need a place to go, and the people in the southern part of our kingdom need a place to go, where they shouldn't have to go clear down to Jerusalem all the time? Isn't that reasonable? And here we are, right? Yeah. Yeah.
And today, if he was in that same position, I would have to accept that.
Yeah.
And say, because of all the changes, and if you speak against that, you're probably pretty apt to get in trouble.
Yeah. And the challenge of that, Jackie, is that on matters such as that, it isn't just a matter, and I'm trying to find the right words, but it's one thing, as we should with any person, to treat every person with respect and the love of God And every person deserves that. It doesn't matter who they are, what they are. But it's not about that. It's about me being told that I have to agree with it. That's the difference. And that's where the challenge comes. It's not about whether we have to treat everyone in respect and be fair and honest with all men. And God didn't put any qualifiers on that and list a handful of sins that said, well, but if they're doing these things, you don't. But that's not really the problem. The problem is that we're being forced to no longer say anything about it. We're being forced to be quiet and not disagree. And then the next natural step is in the progress that they would like to see is that not only are we not allowed to say anything against it, but now we actually have to promote it and agree. And that's the kind of progression that happens over time. And right.
Because we want to say them. But we're not allowed to say it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's wrong.
Yeah.
You can't accept it as a way of life because that way of life is evil and contrary to what God has said. And just keeping it quiet isn't the answer.
Right. Well, and I have always marveled in some ways in my own mind as to why anybody would be offended who generically in most senses have rejected this book to begin with. They're not. And why would they worry about whether I said, well, this book says that's a sin? That's the part I've always wondered about. Why would anybody who's rejected this book, they've said this book doesn't mean anything, it's not real, it's fake, it's a fraud, and yet they're concerned about the fact that I point to it and say, and yet all kinds of hate can be said about me, and no one will blink. No one will blink. That's right, and that's what the Bible says, and that's just the reality. And again, that's not about hate. That's simply about speaking as God said. Yeah. Right. It's hard. It's a difficult circumstance to address, as is any sin that people are entrenched in and have dug their heels into. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. 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 There's all kinds of stuff going on that we're probably hidden from a lot. Yep. Really? Okay. I'm going to briefly. I won't even be here. Gary, do whatever you want to do. Just dawned on me. I've got one more Wednesday away here, and that should be it, at least till May. Whole week and a half.